The first ever mention of Watchmen was when they were previewed on page 32 of a 1985 issue of DC Spotlight, when Swamp Thing and V for Vendetta writer Alan Moore asked audiences, "But what if a superhero appeared in the 1960s with atomic powers? What would happen to the world?" Watchmen issue 1 went on sale in September of 1986, the first of 12 chapters, introducing the world to Rorschach, the Comedian, Night Owl, Ozymandias, Dr. Manhattan, and Silk Spectre. Taking place in an alternate history where the presence of American superheroes had changed the world. America had won the Vietnam War. Richard Nixon was still president into his 4th term. And as the nuclear arms race threatened to spiral out of control, society was braced in anticipation for a global war that would end the human race. The only thing standing in the way of a showdown was Dr. Manhattan. He was once John Osterman, but after a lab accident, he became a hero with godlike abilities. And this would tilt the balance of power strongly in America's favor. Watchmen would completely deconstruct comic book superheroes as a concept. From both the 1930s supergroup the Minutemen through to the crime busters of the 1960s, exploring the personal lives of superheroes and examining the laid-bare ethics and psychological profiling of actual real-world people who would choose to dress up in costume and fight crime. And crucially, the real-world effect this would have on society. As after enjoying the country's love and support for years, superheroes would suffer from a backlash against vigilantism. And in 1977, an emergency bill is enforced outlawing all forms of costumed adventuring. The act forces crime fighters into retirement or hiding. After the assassination of crime buster Edward Blake, aka the Comedian, Rorschach believes that there was a conspiracy and that somebody was targeting masked heroes. He investigates, sparking a chain of events that may potentially change the world forever. There were 3 key elements to the storyline. It was a murder mystery, it was a commentary on political power, it satirized, deconstructed, and critiqued the very nature of superheroes and comic books.
You find that, yes, superheroes in the real world are kind of funny. They're also kind of scary. Because actually a person dressing in a mask and going around beating up criminals is a vigilante psychopath.
Watchmen was reprinted in hardback with all 12 chapters bound together and would go on to win several industry awards and recognition. The comic would be recognized as great art and would go down in history as a landmark masterpiece, selling millions of copies to a global readership. The film rights to Watchmen were bought by producer Lawrence Gordon in August of 1986, before the 4th issue of the comic was even out on sale. He teamed up with producer Joel Silver to work on making the film with 20th Century Fox. Alan Moore was asked to write the screenplay, and he politely declined. Batman 89 writer Sam Hamm was hired, and a first draft was completed in September 1988, with shooting expected to take place September to December of the following year. Arnold Schwarzenegger was said to be in serious discussions to play Dr. Manhattan. The fact that the actor bore little resemblance to the pre-accident Dr. John Osterman would be seemingly worked around. Then, in 1991, Fox lost interest, and the project moved across to Warner Brothers, with the legendary visionary Terry Gilliam hired to direct the Hamm screenplay.
We're doing Watchmen, I haven't started storyboarding yet, and what's interesting is there's the comic book, which is a storyboard in itself, and it has an awful lot of information in it. But I know that the minute I start drawing it, things will happen. You start a dialogue with the drawing. I think that's, if you're a painter, that's what happens. And in a sense, you're always having that dialogue. When you're shooting, there's the set around you, and it changes what your idea from the storyboard. Ooh, then we could do that and that. And you've always got to be responding to those things. But ultimately, it's the storyboard becomes my insurance policy. Whatever, if I run out of ideas on the set, I can always go back to the storyboard, just do that, and I'll have a film at the end of the day. I think, I mean, what's interesting is coming from, a comic book tradition, working with Harvey Kurtzman, because I think Harvey was the one that really began using comic books as a way of using movie techniques in comic books, tracking shots, pullback, zooms in. And that's, I think, why I was first attracted to his stuff. It was just like watching movies. Now everybody does it all the time, and it's and particularly in Watchmen, it's incredible. I mean, that's one of they've almost made it like a film. They've planned it that way.
About Watchmen, what would be the difference through the comic book and the film?
There was a script that was written by Sam Hamm, who that started the project. Charles has just rewritten the script, and now the next job is for me to start the storyboard, and then we'll be away. I hope we're going to be able to, distill Watchmen to the essence of the thing, and still hold on to that, and have all the characters and the same story, and get many of the same points across. It'll always be different because in the comic books, it has a lot of time and a lot of ability to just go into detail upon detail upon detail into the past and the future. And a film is a terrible condensation. We've got the script down to about, it could be 2.5 hours, and I don't know what else to take out, and yet we've only got, I would say, half the comic book in there. And it's terrifying that, films are very terribly simple things.
Schwarzenegger's name would remain attached to Manhattan, with rumors of a Richard Gere signing on to play Night Owl, a Robin Williams portrayal of Rorschach, and Jamie Lee Curtis as the Silk Spectre. Moore would recently say, "When Terry Gilliam was supposed to be doing Watchmen back in the 1980s, I remember he told me that he'd had a number of phone calls from David Bowie asking to play the Rorschach character. There's an alternate world we can only imagine." Hamm aimed to trim a lot of the film's potential running time by condensing storylines or simply removing entire subplots and backstory. The comedian's murder is nothing more than a throwaway anecdote from a cop, and there's no reference to the Minutemen, nor the past history between the comedian and Silk Spectre's mother. Instead, the Watchmen were a disbanded team of superheroes forced to separate over 10 years earlier after accidentally blowing up the Statue of Liberty, capturing terrorists in the opening scene. Dr. Manhattan continues to remain a factor in the events of the Cold War, and the central premise is built around the idea that the existence of Dr. Manhattan has changed the dynamic of society and the world forever. Ozymandias formulates a scheme to induce a wormhole in time and space so he can reach Dr. John Osterman before the accident and his subsequent transformation into a god. Manhattan originally prevents the plan, before deciding that the plan is in fact the only solution. He then goes back in time to prevent himself from existing, resulting in a completely altered future. At the end, the surviving Watchmen are transported to our world, a world in which Watchmen is nothing more than a comic book. And in this reality, the Watchmen appear quite strange in their costumes. Here's the screenwriter speaking to the Projection Booth podcast.
I was very reluctant to do it at first because as much as I liked the comics, I thought they were going to be extremely difficult to translate. So I said I would. And I, wrote my draft, which quickly became known in Hollywood circles as the $1 million a page script. It would be so bleeding expensive to do, and it was pre-CGI, and so there was Dr. Manhattan would basically have to be done as either practical or a photographic effect, and to have a main character who is a shapeshifter and keeps sort of changing size and doing all that kind of stuff was pretty huge, and the action was on a big scale. So one thing that I realized coming into the project that the studios may not have, and I talked about it at some length with the people I was working with, but I said, that the gag here of setting up the faux alien invasion is basically pinched from an Outer Limits episode. And they said, well, oh, no, we didn't know that. And I said, well, it's called The Architects of Fear. And I said, and the troublesome thing is that at the very end of the Watchmen comics, Alan Moore has two of the characters coming into a room, and the television is playing in the background. And I say, now, next up on The Outer Limits, tonight's episode is The Architects of Fear. And so what I had heard later was that he did not realize that, he or did not remember or hadn't seen or whatever, but he did not mean basically to pinch that particular episode. But, the fact that he had specifically referenced it in the comics meant you go to court, you lose the lawsuit. And I said, so we kind of have to figure out a different gimmick here, or, they're going to either sue you guys for an unbelievable amount of money, or, they're going to stop the film's release or something like that. And so they said, come up with, see what you come up with. From there, it was just a matter of trying to find something else that would work.
It was said that Gilliam wasn't fully committed to Ham's screenplay, and so he brought in his own writers, Charles McKeown and Warren Scarron. They redrafted the existing script and put a lot more of the source material back into the film. Rorschach's presence was dialed up in places where much of his characterization had been previously faded out, and his journal would now be included as a narrative device and voiceover. Warner Brothers projected a budget of $25 million. Gilliam asked for more, was refused, and so the director left the project, famously claiming the graphic novel was unfilmable, and that the various layers of plot from 12 books couldn't be condensed and streamlined into a 2-hour movie without losing many of the significant cogs and gears that made the world of Watchmen work in the first place.
It was very frustrating because trying to condense the Watchmen into 2.5 hours is an impossibility, basically. And so, in many ways, the fact that Joel wasn't able to get the financing for it was a kind of relief.
Joel Silver would later reveal more on Gilliam's take on the material, saying, "What Terry did was he told the story as is, but instead of the whole notion of the intergalactic thing, which was too hard and too silly, what he did was he maintained that the existence of Dr. Manhattan had changed the whole balance of the world economy, the world political structure. Gilliam felt that that character really altered the way reality had been. He had the Ozymandias character convince, essentially, the Dr. Manhattan character to go back and stop himself from being created, so there never would be a Dr. Manhattan character. He was the only character with real supernatural powers. He went back and prevented himself from being turned into Dr. Manhattan. And in the vortex that was created after that occurred, these characters from Watchmen only became characters in a comic book. So the three characters, I think it was Rorschach and Night Owl and Silk Spectre, they're all of a sudden in Times Square, and there's a kid reading a comic book. They become like the people in Times Square dressing up like characters as opposed to really being those characters. There's a kid reading the comic book and he's like, "Hey, you're just like in my comic book." It was very smart. It was very articulate. And it really gave a very satisfying resolution to the story. But it just didn't happen. Lost to time. The project remained dormant until 2001. When Blade and X-Men would enjoy major financial success and prove that there was a market for superhero movies. Watchmen was resurrected at Universal Pictures, with producer Gordon teaming up with Lloyd Levin, and the duo would actively pursue X-Men and X2 screenwriter David Hayter to write and direct. Hayter had previously worked on developing early incarnations of Hulk, Iron Man, and Black Widow, and as a true fan of the Watchmen novels, would begin work on a comic-to-screenplay adaptation that retained the plot and the essence of Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons' work. Alan Moore would read Hayter's screenplay and say that it's as close as I could imagine anyone getting to Watchmen. The first draft would, however, clock in at 328 pages. Hayter was pushing to cast Denzel Washington in the role of Dr. Manhattan, and the would-be director had envisioned a John Cusack portrayal of Night Owl. Watchmen would eventually move from Universal to Revolution Studios, and Hayter would shoot the following test footage. Filming took place at London's Pinewood Studios in August 2003. This proof-of-concept piece stars Ray Stevenson and Ian Glenn. The cinematography is by Tony Pierce Roberts.
Rorschach.
Hello, Daniel.
I helped myself to some beans. I hope you don't mind.
No, of course not. Want me to heat some up for you?
No need.
Well, how you been keeping?
Out of prison. So far.
Take a look at this.
This little stain. Is that bean juice?
That's right. Human bean juice. The badge belonged to the comedian. Blood, too. He's dead.
What? The comedian?
First you heard about it.
Well, I haven't kept in touch with anyone since I retired. Listen, it was probably just a burglary. Maybe the killer didn't know Blake was the comedian.
An ordinary burglar killed a comedian. That's ridiculous.
Yeah, I guess it doesn't seem too likely. What were you doing there?
My Thursday night patrol.
Still? Hey, I heard Blake had been working for the government since they passed the Keene Act. Maybe it was a political killing.
Maybe. Or maybe someone's killing off former masked heroes.
Don't think that's a little, paranoid?
Is that what they're saying about me now? That I'm paranoid? I can feel our old enemies out there, gathering.
Rorschach. All the old enemies are dead.
Old ghosts, then. Anyway, just thought I'd let you know. In case someone is killing former men.
Thanks.
At least not everything's retired.
Yeah, right. The tunnel's still open. Let's out in a warehouse on Fleet.
I remember. Used to come here a lot. Back when we were partners.
Yeah. Yeah, those were great times, Rorschach. Great times. Whatever happened to them?
You quit.
David Hayter would remain attached as writer-director on his dream project, and would later explain how he had cast actor Daniel Craig to play Rorschach in the test scene alongside Ian Glenn, only for Craig to drop out the day before he was due on set shooting. The soundstage had already been dressed as Dan's house for the one-day shoot. Craig would say he wasn't feeling it, and as a result, the shoot was postponed for a week, during which time actor Ray Stevenson would step into the role. Hayter would remain working in close partnership with Gordon and Levin in the quest to get Watchmen made. The screenplay would move from Revolution Studios to Paramount Pictures, with Hayter meeting Darren Aronofsky as a potential director. Aronofsky's name would hit the Hollywood trade magazines as if the whole deal was already down on paper, but the director's involvement would be short-lived, as years later, in an interview with Slash Film, he discussed how he got assigned to the project in the first place, saying, "Watchmen. I was on Watchmen for a week. I was literally on it for a week. David Hayter wrote an amazing script. I mean, he really caught it. But literally, I was on for a week. They said, 'Are you interested?' I said, 'Yeah.' We set it up at Paramount in a meeting. And then they said, 'Let's hire a production designer.' And this was literally when Hugh Jackman had just come on and the Fountain thing was going. So I was like, 'Guys, I'm about to shoot the Fountain. You know, we can hire a designer, but I'm going to be shooting this movie while that's happening.' Then they quickly put Paul Greengrass on it. So I had very little to do with the project. I wish they would remove my name from Watchmen because I never really got involved." Prior to Paul Greengrass's involvement, the studio briefly considered re-teaming director Tim Burton with Johnny Depp to play the comedian. But then, riding high from the plaudits of The Bourne Supremacy, director Greengrass joined in November 2004. The world-famous Pinewood studio would house the production design as sets were being built, costumes designed, and hours of test FX and pre-visualization shots. There were sketch concepts of Dr. Manhattan by graphic artist Tristan Shane, and a special effects test was carried out against green screen to see if it could be done in camera using practical effects. And it was all seemingly great news that the film had a director who was a big fan of the source material and seemingly had a clear vision he hoped to execute. A new target release date was set for summer 2006. A teaser website was set up, offering fans a downloadable wallpaper. An artist, Adam Brockbank, would begin creating character art and Mars concepts for the production designer Dominic Watkins. During these early periods of trying to determine the aesthetic and look of the world, Greengrass would say, "I agree it is the greatest graphic novel ever written. It was political, dark, conspiratorial, and was something really important to say about the world, as well as being a fantastic comic book ride. I think it can be made into a film. I think it's going to be fun." Greengrass's cast was rumored to consist of Paddy Considine as Rorschach, Jude Law as Ozymandias, Joaquin Phoenix as Night Owl, Hilary Swank as Silk Spectre, and Ron Perlman as the comedian. When Paul Greengrass directed the spy thriller The Bourne Supremacy, based on the novel by Robert Ludlum, the series had updated the film setting from the Cold War to the present day, and it was hoped this could be repeated for David Hayter's next pass at the Watchmen screenplay. This would be in New York after the events of 9/11, when America's weaponized and regulated super being Dr. Manhattan leaves the planet. Enemy states from Western Asia and the Middle East begin a series of offensive moves that could lead to nuclear war and mutually assured destruction. The character of the comedian would still work as an undercover agent in foreign countries, helping to overthrow rulers and destabilize the infrastructure. But where the graphic novel states that Blake was born in 1924, the script has him born in 1944. So instead of the 1985 setting of the comics, the updating would take place in a 2004 timeframe. The comedian in the comics had served in World War II and Korea and Vietnam. This revised version would see him as a young soldier at the tail end of the Vietnam War, and his later service in the Gulf War, followed by tours in Iraq and the Middle East. The United States conflict with Russia in the comic book is changed to one with Afghanistan. All references to communists were switched with Middle Eastern terrorists, and the updated script was based on the notion that the Bush-Blair era of political decision-making would make the themes of Watchmen as relevant then as back in 1986. Paul Greengrass's Watchmen would try to explore the modern paranoia of the time without losing any of the novel's story and character elements. Here's screenwriter David Hayter.
I did set it in a contemporary setting. I brought forward a lot of the modern incidents like 9/11, things like that. The Iraq War, tried to bring the politics up to date for the 2010s. The themes were not, they were still unfortunately very relevant to today. So, it took a bit of gymnastics, but I did update it to present day. And then that was one of the things that Zack Snyder decided to go back to the 80s. Having been a kid in the 80s, the threat of nuclear war was so huge and oppressive, and we had kind of forgotten that in the early 2000s. We forgot that in the 80s we all walked around expecting nuclear bombs to fall on us within half an hour, and that'd be that. So I thought there was value in kind of reminding people that all those nuclear bombs are still out there, and the threat is still very real.
Dr. Manhattan was a key character for Greengrass. How would Adrian's plan be executed upon a world that didn't particularly want to be peacefully united? Would Adrian's plan even work? Or would it just divide society even further apart? ComicBookResources.com would conduct an insightful interview with production designer Dominic Watkins, who had just worked on Greengrass's Bourne movie and was hired for the proposed shoot. Watkins would later release several pieces of concept art saying, "We basically put together a production book, and when Paramount closed it down to send it to Warner Brothers, Greengrass was attached to it. He then decided to do United 93 and was supposed to Watchmen right after, but moved on to the third Bourne movie, which was a big disappointment to me because I felt we had something much more original here. This production book was page by page, set to set what we were going to be shooting. We were that close to shooting. We were still in pre-production, but I think we were about a week away from breaking ground at Pinewood Studios and building a backlot based on the west side of Manhattan. It was kind of a conglomerate of downtown in the teens, between 5th and 6th Avenue and a couple other areas mixed in. I think we were going to build square blocks, so I was quite surprised they pulled the plug on it, because at that point I'd imagined they'd spend at least $2 or $3 million just to get everything up and running. The visual effects team were doing tests and various other things. But that's Hollywood. I thought it was interesting because I thought we could do something very interesting that hadn't been done before. The Nolan Batman hadn't been done at that point, so everything was still kind of very sterilized. I thought that the political climate from Bush was escalated to a similar point, with us on the brink of something quite catastrophic. So I thought making a version of Watchmen that was more contemporary and applying it to the decade of the 2000s was a good idea, and was a lot more relevant than it turned out to be. Ours was definitely going to be based on the graphic novel, and all the characters would have been drawn on that, but we'd have updated it somewhat. Ours was going to be an original take on it, while trying to do as much justice to the graphic novel as possible. It would have been done a little bit documentary style, with a little news reporting mixed in. I feel like that would have really been interesting to see it as real feeling as possible. Obviously, Dr. Manhattan was always going to be the biggest challenge to that. When there's a 50-foot blue man, it's hard to cinematically make it feel real. 6 weeks into pre-production, Greengrass would share his angle on the material in an interview with Chud.com, saying, "One of the things that distinguishes Watchmen is that it's about the way we live today. At that point, it was about the way that we lived then. I think we need to make a film of Watchmen that reflects the times we live in. We are once again in very paranoid times. I'm talking about the post-9/11 world. we have been in levels of paranoia that we last experienced at the time of Watchmen. That's what drives us. We fear Al-Qaeda. We fear terrorists. But I think underneath there is a much deeper fear. How do we keep peace in a world where these technologies are spreading? That's what I think we have to use Watchmen to address. I think it's really important. The essential dynamic at the heart of this adaptation was to be the tension between Dr. Manhattan and Adrian. It was crucial to Greengrass that on this production, the settings, the streets, and the landmarks look recognizable and realistic. A world we understand and feel a sense of familiarity in. The New York of 2004, as opposed to the heightened, stylized reality of a Tim Burton Gotham City. Greengrass would say, an alternate history is a brilliant conceit. It is not the world we lived in, but the world we might have lived in. And it was a very idea that we would have been determined to get across in this film. How would people react to a government-sanctioned Superman? What's really important is that when you sit inside that world of our ensemble of Caped Crusaders, that you understand that these are human characters, flawed characters, that they are not superheroes, or that only one of them technically really is, Dr. Manhattan. And it's that concept that you have to have a human drama that involves this cast of characters and that you understand where they come from. That this is not just a casual thing that they do. They do it because they are compelled. One of Greengrass's more unusual influences on finding a tone for a live-action Watchmen was the Milos Forman adaptation of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Greengrass would say, "There's something about it, in an odd way, that reminds me of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, both the novel and the film. You're looking at a world that is of our world, but yet is very separate. If we cast this film right, with the right actors, as I believe we will, then we will be able to convey as those characters in Cuckoo's Nest conveyed so magnificently. A world within a world. You are entering a private society that exists within our own society. It speaks to us, and yet its wardrobe and behavior are totally different. But there is, within its differentness, its separateness, a kind of heroism, a quality of compassion, a degree of humanity." Greengrass also showed his team the photography of Diane Arbus, feeling that her work captured the same sense of alone together that he wanted his Watchmen movie to evoke. Diane Arbus was an American photographer best known for her intimate black and white portraits. Arbus often photographed outcasts, eccentrics, true originals, and various other individuals who wander lost and lonely on the fringe outskirts of society. Greengrass would say, "I think it's important that we do it, and that our audience, particularly the Watchmen community, know that it's being done and enjoy that it's being done, and that it's done on a sophisticated level." Over the last few weeks, I've asked my team to watch a BBC drama made at about the time that Watchmen came out called Threads. It was one of those unique events you can only have in a country like Britain on television, where everybody tunes in to watch the same thing at the same time. Threads was a dramatization of what would happen if there was a nuclear conflict in Britain now. And I'm talking 1986-ish when it came out. I remember it as one of those seminal audience moments in my life of watching something where I was horrified, compelled, just could not lift my eyes from the screen. I was watching something that was speaking to me about what was happening in the world. It was actually a very beautiful screenplay about a young couple in Sheffield moving into their first apartment together. It was full of youthful hope. I think she was pregnant. It was set against this gathering international crisis that nobody took any notice of until these individual dramas got blown apart by this terrible cataclysm. A lot of it was told in bits of news footage in newspapers, told in the exact same way that Alan Moore tells it in Watchmen. It's just at the heart of his story is this Caped Crusader murder mystery, showing the way the world can turn can be utterly compelling and ask you questions. That's why I believe passionately that we can make this thing work in 2 hours, because we will have a piece that will speak to our fears and also show us some ways to deal with our fears. In some places in Watchmen, that's there too. Greengrass had wanted to film Watchmen in a handheld docudrama format. The style that is now seen as Greengrass's signature is very fluid, raw, kinetic, and up close to the action. An aesthetic he developed out of practical necessity as a documentarian in Britain, needing to follow and record all manner of unpredictable situations. This rapidly edited shaky cam had rarely been seen in movies previously, and is something that would give The Bourne's supremacy its own distinct and frenzied style. With production slated to start at Paramount Studios, once described as the place where dreams go to die, news would filter out of Hollywood that new Paramount chief, Brad Grey, would make a surprise move to replace his studio president, Donald DeLine, with Gail Berman. With Paul Greengrass's Watchmen budgeted at $120 million, which converted at the time to £64 million in England, Paramount was reported to have been put off by the unfavorable exchange rate, and a continued uncertainty over government tax breaks for big-budget foreign productions. When adding up all of these contributing factors together, it's fair to say that Watchmen wasn't Berman's cup of tea, and the plug was officially pulled. It was estimated that the decision had cost Pinewood Studios about £2.2 million in lost revenue. As Greengrass would eventually exit the project, millions were starting to accumulate in pre-production costs against the back end of the movie. And it was then that Warner Brothers, in control of DC Comics, would realize they held the ancillary rights, and so would go all out to finally bring the famous title to life. It was then during a producer's screening, showing the work-in-progress footage of Zack Snyder's 300, it was decided that Snyder was the correct director to make things happen. Similar to his approach to 300, Snyder used the comic book as a storyboard, and the buzz surrounding Snyder's work was so positive that bosses would commit him to Watchmen before 300 would even hit theaters. Following negotiations, Paramount, which had already spent $7 million in their failed project, earned the rights for the international distribution of Watchmen and 25% of the film's ownership. Snyder would go on to make a faithful, inventive, stylish, and visually engaging big-screen recreation of the comic book that would premiere to audiences on the 23rd of February, 2009. And so, all's well that ends well. And that concludes the history of Watchmen's struggle to reach the big screen. Thanks for watching.